Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and certainly Nikon has been publicized here on YouTube and of course in other reporting areas as going through a bit of some struggles when it comes to their bottom line, and so they have desperately needed a home run to help to turn things around for them. And a lot of people feel like that has arrived in the form of the new D850. The D850 is Nikon's new kind of flagship. No, it's not, up at the D5 level, but this is kind of the camera for, working professionals that don't necessarily need a specialized camera for sports use, but a general purpose, excellent camera. And, early reports on this camera have been excellent and with a lot of good reasons. It's got a lot going for it. And no, I am not a Nikon reviewer, but a friendly viewer, subscriber who wants to remain anonymous asked if I'd like to borrow his D850 along with a couple of lenses that I happen to have, also in a Nikon mount where I could, in a Canon mount where I could do a direct comparison, kind of an apples to apples comparison with the 5D Mark IV and the D850. And so I said, why not? And while this isn't going to be an exhaustive review of the D850 because I don't have time for that, and frankly, I don't necessarily feel like I'm qualified to do that in that I have zero experience with the Nikon ecosystem, and so I don't really have a frame of reference for doing that. But what I can do is some controlled type test where I compare basic things of sensor performance and just give you an idea of how all of that shapes out. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump in and I'm going to give you some direct comparisons as we look at some aspects of sensor performance. Things like ISO performance, dynamic range, pushing shadows, pushing highlights, kind of some of those most important sensor attributes, along with how that resolution actually plays out. So let's jump in, let's take a look at that. So we're going to start at base ISO for both of these cameras, which is not the same. The Nikon D850 has the lowest base ISO of any of the competitors at 64 compared to a base ISO of 100 for the Canon. So you'll see there is some variance in the shutter speed here. Now, if we take a look at the images from both lenses, we're going to see that number one, they don't frame exactly the same because the Nikon image, of course, is significantly larger. It's 8,256 by 5504, whereas the Canon image is 6720 by 4480. So the difference between a 47 megapixel and a 30 megapixel, which is a significant difference. And so you can see the difference in the framing there. So periodically what I'm going to do is I've actually gone into Photoshop and I have downsampled the D850 to the same resolution as the Canon here, and so that just gives you a ability to see an apples to apples comparison. Now at base ISO here, you can see obviously that we have a essentially perfectly clean background from both of these in terms of the actual detail here. And remember, while we're using the same lens in each native mount, there can be some sample variation. And just looking at the base image here, I actually prefer that of the Canon, which looks a little bit sharper, but again, that could be lens specific. And so in terms of the the base appearance of the contrast here at base ISO and the amount of resolution being pumped out, in a lot of ways I think I favor what the Canon is producing here. Now, comparing the base image from ISO 64 to ISO 100 on the D850, does that actually make a difference? I've gone back to the full-size images here on both of them, and so you can see that I think that there is a bit more contrast at the base ISO than there is on ISO 100, and so it's certainly not a gimmick. It seems to have the image at ISO 64, and to my eye seems to have a little bit more punch. So jumping up to ISO 800, and we'll come back to ISO 400 in a bit for a different purpose, but looking at the out of focus area here, both of them are still nice and smooth. However, to my eye, and I can see just the faintest bit of striations there in the Nikon image, just a little tiny bit of color banding that I'm not seeing on the Canon image. Now, just taking a look at the two lined up together here, we can see that, there definitely is, there's more, to my eye, there's more contrast and punch from the Canon lens, or the Canon image, whether or not that's, lens specific or sensor specific, but certainly the basic contrast looks better to my eye out of the Canon than it does out of the Nikon. But, a lot of this is looking at the D8 focus area, and it just seems to me that, while there's a little bit difference in exposure, metering wise, you can see that the Canon always metered just a little bit darker, and frankly, to my eye, a little bit more accurately than what the Nikon did. But anyway, as a result, I do think that the noise is a little bit rougher here at ISO 800. And just so you know, on these tests, I did put a custom white balance into both cameras to color match the actual Kelvin value of the lights I was using. Now, as we move up to ISO 1600, you can definitely start to see some more apparent color banding. There's green and magenta patches that are separating, whereas we still have a almost perfectly smooth look from the Canon. And so at these kind of mid ISO levels, I definitely think the Canon has given us a stronger performance, and this is definitely not attributed to any lens. That is, that's sensor performance there. But we can see, once again, we still have, better punch out of the Canon image than we do out of the Nikon. So here at ISO 3200, you can see the cameras continue to meter a little bit differently. But taking a look at the kind of defocused area, you can continue to see, the magenta and, green patches there. Starting to see a tiny bit of that on the Canon. However, at this stage, I would say that the noise pattern is still a little less rough on the Canon than it is on the Nikon. Looking at our subject itself, we're seeing pretty much as we have, but I do want to point out that to the credit of both of these cameras, in terms of actual looking at the subject area, they really haven't lost anything along the way stopping down this far. They're both very, very clean, look very good. So as we move on up to ISO 6400, what we're going to see in our defocused area is pretty much a similar pattern to what we've seen thus far. Both of them are continuing to do a good job of producing a clean output here, and so no hesitations or complaints there. Now, it's at ISO 12800 that I feel like a shift begins to start to take place, in that I find that the Canon magenta and green, kind of patches of some, not necessarily banding, but just kind of color patches becoming more pronounced on the Canon, whereas I feel like we have a little bit more even defocused, kind of coloration out of the Nikon by comparison. I would say that the Nikon noise pattern is every bit as rough, but looking at the images globally, it seems to me that you can see more of that color variation on the Canon image. Now, looking in at our subject here once again, contrast on the Canon still looks, pretty awesome. The blacks are starting to get a little bit more noisy, as they are on the Nikon, but the contrast remains really strong. But I do feel like the Nikon is starting to catch up here. So here at ISO 25600, we're going to see that, once again, I find that while the noise pattern is, fairly heavy here on the Nikon, the coloration, and we'll step back and look at it globally, it's fairly even. You can see just a little bit of evidence of banding in there, but you can definitely see more color variation here on the Canon side. If we look down at our subject, we can see that, once again, we're kind of observing the same things. But let's just take a look to kind of equalize these images if we downsample the Nikon image to the Canon side. So here with the Nikon image downsampled to the resolution of the 5D Mark IV, we can see that now the Nikon background shows a little bit less of that banding, and the noise pattern is actually a little less rough than that of the Canon. And then if we look here towards our subject, you'll see there's just the slightest bit of a magenta cast here that's creeping into to some of the dark areas on the Canon that are a little bit less so on the Nikon. And so with all things equalized, you know, I would say that there is a little bit of an advantage for the Nikon, particularly in just the basic noise pattern and decoloration due to the pixel noise. So now, just for the fun of it, at the base ISO of ISO 64, I underexposed, you know, moving down by a total of 4 stops. So I wanted to see if there was a big difference between pushing the ISO image, and so now I've pushed it back in post 4 stops to recover based at ISO 64 and then ISO 100. So here, looking at our subject, we can see that there is definitely once again, you can tell a difference. It's subtle, but I see more contrast, even though this has been pushed. By the way, this has been pushed 4 stops and it still is very, very clean. I've recovered, you know, from this kind of image to this image, and you know, that's certainly a significant recovery, and we've seen that it's nice and clean there. But we can definitely see that there's more contrast at base ISO than at ISO 100, and so definitely use that base ISO to its advantage. And so pushing these has left an image that's really quite clean for a foreshadow recovery. So when you're shooting at base ISO, you have got a tremendous amount of latitude with the Nikon body here. So what about if we do the same thing with the Canon image here? And so both of them at the exact same settings, both of them have now been pushed significantly. And so we're going to see that also, of course, the Canon image holds up really well. Also, it's recovered very nicely here at its own base ISO. So certainly at, you know, base ISO versus ISO on the Nikon, you're going to get better results from the Canon, which is its base setting, compared to the Nikon. But we see here with both of them at their base, they've both done a really great job of recovering all of the shadow information, and at the same time, you know, retaining a lot of integrity and detail there, and not really a huge hit. You can definitely see a little bit more, I think, magenta noise in the out of focus area from the Canon, but you know, a good job really done by both cameras. So what about ISO invariance? What that means is that if you take the ISO 400 image and you push it 4 stops, you know, it gives you the ability, you know, in recovering shadows to, you know, perhaps shoot in that kind of setting, so underexposing quite a bit, and then in post-processing, pushing the shadow information, pushing the image itself, and to see the result that you get. So here's a comparison on the Nikon. I've started with ISO 400, and there we've got our straight up ISO 6400 image shot there. And so let's just take a quick peek and see what we discover here. As we look at our subject, we can see that they certainly look pretty similar here. And you know, it does such a great job of recovering shadows that we can see we really haven't lost a whole lot. And in terms of the amount of noise that is there, you know, you definitely have a little bit smoother in terms of the actual grain or noise pattern. It's a little smoother, less pronounced, less rough than that at ISO 6400. And so I would say that you can definitely use this technique, which means you have a lot of latitude with this Nikon sensor, that if you underexpose, you're definitely able to pull it back. Now, if we try to do the same thing with the Canon, we see that pushing the image 4 stops at ISO 400 has not produced nearly as clean a result. You know, while the subject itself looks fine, you can see that there is discoloration here. And looking through here, you can definitely see some color banding that has taken place. And so pushing the ISO 400 image isn't as successful with the Canon, and in this case, because the Canon is so good at ISO 6400, I think that rather than trying to push it that hard, I would rather just shoot at the higher ISO setting, because even in looking at the noise pattern, it definitely doesn't look as clean in the pushed image as it does on the actual you know, native ISO image. If we look at the two pushed images, the Canon here on the left and the D850 on the right, you can see that there's a significant difference between you know, the result that we get when we push these shadows. And so here is, I think, one of the probably the greatest strength in differentiating the two that I've seen, in that the Nikon image seems to have more ability to be pushed. So what happens if you take that shadow recovery out into the real world? I happen to have both a copy of the Canon mount of the Tamron 15-30 as well as the Nikon mount, so I could do a head-to-head comparison. Now, I didn't set a custom white balance here out of the camera, so you can see the difference in the way that they both render. And so, you know, you definitely get more of a kind of a cyan, a greenish cast here out of the Nikon, natively to that of the Canon. You know, and you know, your mileage may vary in terms of what you prefer. I personally instinctively like the actual color rendition out of the Canon a little bit better, and I think in terms of the sky coloration, it was more consistent with what I saw. So for our actual comparison, what I've done is I've actually just put in the same white balance into both cameras, since it was a raw file, and so you can see a little bit more without that as equation. Now what I've done is I've taken the image that I showed you, and I have taken in the develop module here in Lightroom, I've taken the shadow slider and I've pushed it all the way to the right. So as much kind of recovery is what I can get. So what you're going to see is that as we look at comparison here, you know, settings all being equal, what we're going to see is that even at ISO 100, what we're seeing is that you're going to recover a little bit more light in the shadows, you know, all things being equal, with the actual Nikon than you are with the Canon. And so here you can see I've already reduced the file size to the same size as that of the Canon, and so that's not a factor here. And so as we just kind of peruse around, you're going to see that, you know, like in this area here, you can see that the Canon has not recovered as much kind of information in the shadows. What's there is relatively clean, but the Nikon has delivered a stronger recovery of the shadows than what the Canon has, which reinforces once again that the real strength of the Nikon sensor here is its ability to kind of recover that, you know, dynamic range. The ability to push shadows certainly is a strength, and we can see here that there's just more recoverable information from the Nikon than what we're able to see out of the Canon. So if we drop the Nikon down to what is its actual native ISO, I think that that advantage really just, it grows more. We can see that now there's even more shadow recovery, and what also is more apparent is that there's more detail there. And once again, I have down-resed the Nikon image, and so that they'll line up perfectly. That does give a bit of an advantage, you know, because you're cramming more pixels into the same space, but that's the advantage of having a higher resolution sensor. So as a result, what we can see here is that, you know, while the Canon image looks good, there's no concerns there in terms of shadow recovery, but what we can see is there's definitely more detail and just a bigger range that's been picked back up by the Nikon sensor. The whites are wider, but in the shadow, there's more information that's recovered. So here we have, you know, we've kind of overexposed here. We've exposed for the shadows, and so the shadows are all, you know, already nicely exposed for. So what happens in terms of pulling back? Now, in this case, unfortunately, there wasn't much sky to recover, but I'm going to give you a look at what happens there. That if we slide this all the way to the left, what we're going to see is that there was some, you know, lost information there in the, that was, if I go back to 0 here, you see that there was some information that was lost, blown out there, that is actually recovered quite nicely along the edges of the tree. And so that gives you an idea at base ISO what's happening there. Now how about on the Canon? We can see the same kind of thing, that we've got things blown out there. We pull that slider all the way to the left, and we certainly recover some information there in, you know, which could be the sky. And so I think again that there may be just a slight bit more out of the Nikon image there. So where that plays out in the real world is that there is a lot of latitude with the Nikon for recovering lost shadow information. And so in this case, you know, I did a serious underexposure. You know, as you can see, we're going from this to recovering that. And so yes, there's definitely some noise here, which I could reduce further just by, you know, kind of downsampling the image, but that's without any kind of noise reduction. But, you know, we're going from literally no information at all to being able to recover a lot of information, and information in a usable kind of way. Here's a less extreme example here where I have, pulled up shadow information, and this is ISO 200. So we've seen that if I had actually been here on a tripod, where I didn't need a little bit higher shutter speed and could shoot at base ISO, I would have an even cleaner result and even more information recovered here out of that shadow. Likewise here, this gives you an idea of your ability to recover a lot of information even in the highlights. Now obviously with the epicenter of the sun, there's only so much of that you're going to get back, but if we look at this zone over here, we can definitely make a significant difference and recover a lot of information, for example, in the clouds here and in this area here, just by affecting that slider there. So this is also useful in other areas here. For example, if I just grab that highlight slider and I pull it to the left, all of a sudden I've got a fully recovered great looking image here that had a lot of hot spots and blown out areas. And so certainly a lot of latitude in that sensor for allowing you to process images to taste. So as you can see, the 5D Mark IV, although it's a little bit older at this point compared to the newer D850, it actually handles itself quite well when you're working through the actual native ISO range and even in pushing shadows, to a certain limit. But what we found is that while I think the advantage of the Nikon sensor is shown, probably doesn't really show up until about ISO 12,800 and later, and it's just a little bit better in the native range. But where the Nikon sensor really shows its worth is in the ability to push shadows and push highlights and to take misses, or not just misses. It just basically gives you more control over what you want to be exposed as a part of the scene. So there's a lot of photographers going to find that shots that might have been ruined or lost at a different point in time, that they're going to be able to recover those shots and still get very clean results. And I would also suspect that those that have relied more on shooting, like HDR type images in the past are going to perhaps see less of a need to do that. And of course, the D850 also has the option of doing pixel shift to give you even more resolution. For example, in landscape type images when you have a subject that's completely still. And so certainly a really, really great sensor in the D850. And so until next time, we're going to wrap up the first part of this two-part series. And so check back next time. We're going to look at some things like autofocus and resolution, and we're going to break down the difference between these cameras a little bit more. I'm Dustin Abbott, and if you haven't already, you can follow me on social media. And if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.